Welcome to Webinar Wednesday. My name is Paul Johnson. I'm a software solutions architect with Profit Business Group and have been with the organization for over 10 years. This webinar will provide information on what is SRSS and how to use it. This webinar is geared towards the financial analyst role, and there will be some subject matter that is a little more technical in nature. The webinar is being recorded and chat is available for you, the audience, to ask questions. Chat is not being recorded. Our outcome for today is to look at SQL reporting services, or SRSS, and how it is related to Dynamics GP. We will review SRSS reports, security, and using the report builder to build your own reports from Dynamics GP data. We will also review security and subscriptions. So let's jump into a demo of what SRSS is. So SRSS is browser-based tool. So if I open up a browser within my environment and go to a URL that is deployed, usually it's the server where the SQL reporting service is deployed. In my case, it's http ppg demo serve /reports. And if I go to that location, it's going to bring me to the home page. Now, as long as I'm logging into Windows with my Windows user ID that has been granted access to the reports, I should see reports on this page. So if I'm, browsing from home or something, obviously I wouldn't be able to get to this location. I have to be within the environment or connected to a VPN or something to that effect. But I would see all the reports that I have access to. There's also some out-of-the-box reports that have been deployed as part of GP. I'm just going to walk through that. So we're just going to launch GP here. This is, if you did see the webinar last week, this is very similar to the reports that Kale would have covered off in deploying Excel reports. It's really the same similar functionality. So once logged into GP, I would go to the administration area page and select reporting tool setup. So Excel reports we covered last week. So I would select the reporting services tab at the top here, put in my report server URL, which is defined as basically the name of your server and report server, and then the report manager URL, which is similar to reports. This is the same URL we use to connect from the browser. And most of the time this would be the Dynamics GP instance. I would leave this blank in most cases. In this environment we have multiple GP instances, so that's why this is defined here. I would then at the bottom here select which companies to deploy the reports for. So as you can see, these have been deployed for Fabricam already, and I would put a checkbox, and if I was redeploying them I would select redeploy, and then I would hit deploy reports, and that would deploy the out-of-the-box reports. So the only issue with using the out-of-the-box reports is if I bring one of these up here, is go to the company, we look at one of the financial reports. These reports have a lot of parameters in them. They're very difficult to modify. They're based off report models. So I like to just build my own reports or use my own views, which is what I'll be showing you today. There are two main security components related to SQL reporting services. One is giving a user access to the actual reports themselves in the browser here. And the second piece is giving them access to the underlying data of the report itself. So if I wanted to give somebody access to the actual reports, if I go back to my home page, the first step is going to Sites Settings and going to Security and actually adding a user or group and actually granting them a role. So the role would be either system administrator or system user. In most cases, it's going to be system user. So I'd put in their Windows AD, so I'd put in the domain / and then their obviously their user ID. So I have Kale and Victor here set up in GPadmin. The second piece is going to be going back to the home page. And going to manage folder. And here's where I would select, once again, domain / username, and actually grant them access to a particular role. So most of the time they're going to have browser-based role, and that would give them access to the actual file or RDL files. And if I wanted somebody to have access to report builder, I can give them access here as well. Or if I need them to be able to publish reports, very similar, or manage content, I'd give them access to that particular role. So as you can see, administrator has content manager. These other individual users have been granted all the roles. But now the way security works is it's hierarchical structure security. So if I've given somebody access to a particular folder, unless I break inheritance, they would have access to every folder within that folder, and obviously whatever RDL within that folder. So if I go into our reports here and go back into our company and go to financial, I can go to manage, I can set the permissions at the folder level. So I can hit customize security, and I'm going to get a message that says, it's inherited from its parent item. I can break this at this level, hit OK, and specify which users would have access to this particular report or folder. The way, in one area where you may use this is you may want somebody to have access to, financial or inventory reports, but not necessarily some financial reports. You can actually break inheritance and create that security model for yourself. Second part of security is security to the data itself. So the way you would do that is you go to SQL Management Studio, typically installed on your server, and go to security, logins. Now you would want to define a new login. So the way you do that is go to logins, new login. Now this can be a user or a specific AD group. So I find it easier to manage security if you create groups and then add people to those groups. That way you're only doing this once, and then your typically IT would be administering access to reports. So if I had an AD group called SRSS users as an example here, which I've already created, I'm just going to go to that one, and we're just going to go properties. Now I'd go, once the group is created, I go to user mappings, and it's a requirement that Dynamics database that they're assigned Dyn group and RPT all user role within that database. And then any company databases, so 201 as an example, they would need Dyn group as well again, and they would need some type of RPT role. Now each one of these RPT roles grants them a different subset of data. So if you select RPT power user as an example, they'll have basically select access to all the data within that database. So the next thing is how to access Report Builder and build your own reports. So typically you would install a Report Builder application. This can be downloaded or could be part of the SQL install, depending on which version of SQL you're using. So I'm just going to bring this up. So I have Report Builder here. and this is connecting to the report server homepage. Now I can use a wizard to create my report. I can use a blank report or open an existing one and modify it and save it as something else. In my case, I'm going to use this wizard to create a report. Now, first thing you're going to do is you're going to create a data set or connect to an existing data source. So I'm just going to create a data set, hit next here. And this is going to ask me which data source I want to connect to. So I'm just going to connect to GPTW in this case, but I could create a new data source. And I'll actually show you how to do that. So we're going to click New for a new data source. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it Webinar. And I'm going to select connection type as SQL Server, and we're going to hit Build. And I'm going to select my server, so PPG Demo Serve in this case. And we're going to use SQL authentication. Or we could use Windows authentication to connect to the server. We'll leave it as Windows in this case. And then connect to which database once. So I'm going to select a TWO 001 in this case. And we're going to test our connection, and it's connected. Hit OK. And for credentials, it's using Windows authentication, and hit OK. So I've created a data source called Webinar, and I'm going to click Next. And this is where I can select tables views to connect to. So in our case, we're going to select a particular view. I'm going to select customers, basically view, list of all the customers in the system. And I'm going to unselect, I don't want all the columns returned, so I'm only going to select certain columns like customer number, name, address, address to, city, state. We're also going to select customer class. And I'm going to select year-to-date balance as well. Total sales year-to-date. Now I can also apply a filter, so I could do like add a filter and say I want a filter where, you know, state equals Illinois as an example, or whatever it may be, but I can add that in there if I wanted to restrict the amount of data returned. I can run the query to get back to see what the data returned is. So at this point I'm okay with it. I can, even if I'm comfortable, I can edit the text itself, the actual query. So this is a simple query. Hit next. Now the next part of the wizard is what do I want columns, groups, values. So total sales I want in, you know, as my values, and I want it by customer classes, my row group in this particular case. And I'm going to hit next. Now I can show subtotals and grand totals. I'll leave that on and finish. So this basically creates my matrix report, or matrix table of my report. Some other things I can do is give it a title. So sales by customer class as an example. Now if I was to run this report at this point, I can hit run within the builder. This will go connect to the data and return a subset of data for me. So sort of looks like a report. Doesn't look great yet. I can go back to my design view and actually format this. So as you can see, the numbers didn't look great, so I can change this to currency format. We're going to make the customer class a little wider. We're going to make this column, it's bolded already. I can take off the bold. I can make the font size larger, change the color of the font. I'm going to add some gray background to this particular text boxes. So I'm just going to change that to light gray. Same thing on my total. And now if I run the report, this is looking a lot better. Another thing I can do is around the box or cells themselves, I can put some borders. I can change the border width and style. I'm just going to run this again. As you can see, this is looking a lot better. It's looking like a report I could actually use here. From Report Builder, I can also export to Excel and see how this looks just by clicking the export button, or print it, change print layout. I also have the time, execution time of the report that it ran. I can remove this. So very similar to if you're used to working in Word as an example, and working with the ribbon and stuff, you shouldn't have any problems working and modifying this and making it look a little prettier. So let's say I want to see, if I run this report and I want to see the actual detail behind what makes up which customers are part of this particular customer class. I can't really easily do that. It's not a drill down type report. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select this and just delete this particular table from the report. I'm going to insert a new table, not a matrix table, but an actual table. And I actually have to bind this to the data set. So if I was to right click on here, or sorry, you have to click on the box in the top corner, Table X Properties, and under data set name I can actually bind this to my data set. So my data set was called, I just left it as the name data set. I probably should have given it a little bit better name, but as you can see, it has customer name, number, address, and a bunch of other stuff we selected. So I've done the binding. I'm going to add some columns into here. So I'm going to add our customer class column, and I'm going to add your total sales year to date. And at this point, that's all I'm going to have in the report. And I'm just going to select run. As you can see, it's listing, basically each instance of the customer class. Let me go back to design and I'll add another column in here just to show you. If I add customer name, that's really what we're after, the class they belong to, and hit run. So here's the class, the name, total sales year to date. I'm on page 1. I can scroll through and see all the pages. So that's great, but it's not really summarized. So what I'm going to do is select a row, and I'm going to add a grouping or a parent group to this. And I'm going to select our customer class as our parent group, and I want to add a footer because I want a total by customer class. So I'm going to hit OK. So as you can see, it's now added. Here's my detail row, and it's added a footer, which is customer class. I'm just going to delete this first column because I don't really want this column in the report. So I have customer class name. Now I'm just going to do total sales because I want total sales, and I want customer class to be on that row. I want to see the customer class. So if I was to run the report now, I'm going to get a particular customer class, and I'm going to get a total at the bottom here, which is this column here. So it's looking a little better, not great though. So we can do a couple other things to really spruce this up. So what I want is I want to show the customer class row, but hide the actual detail row and only have it visible when I basically click on a button to expand or the particular row. So I'm first going to click on this particular cell and see what the name of the cell. So it's called customer class 1 is that cell's parameter. So I'm just going to click on this row, right click on it and select row visibility, and I'm going to hide that particular row, and I'm going to say I can toggle this row based on our customer class 1 cell. So I'm going to select that, hit OK. So now what will happen is when I run this, I'm going to get the customer classes with this little plus button located next to them. That's great. I'm just going to make this look a little better for us. So I'm going to make this a little wider, change this to be currency. Once again, we're going to bold that particular column, and we'll set this to be bold as well, and we'll run this again. So looking a lot better. Now if I click on one of these buttons, it expands it, and I can actually see the detail that makes up that particular category. I'm going to go back to design. I'm just going to not make this bold, just to give it a little bit better of a contrast. So I'm basically done with my report at this point. We'll just run it again. As you can see, that's what it looks like. I don't need this column in here. I'll delete that. Right click, delete column. Make these bold. So pretty basic report we've created. Now if I want to save this report, I would click the save button or go file, save as. So we're going to select save. What this will do is it'll pop up and it'll want you to connect to your report server, which we're already connected to. And then it's going to ask you which folder you want to save this into. So I can select a folder, or I can just have it go to the default location. So I just named, in my particular case, named this webinar. And just cancel that for a second. So I've already deployed that report, and it's on the home page, and as you can see, it's sitting here as webinar. So if I click on that to run the report, it's going to run the report similar to what we had before. I can expand this and see the data. So that's all great report, but let's now go into a scenario where I want to run the report and actually send it out daily to a bunch of users, or without them having to manually go in here, run the report, look at it. I just want them to get an email and actually get the report. That's done through something called subscriptions, and I will walk through that right now. So I've created a second version of the report, just called webinar sub here. So the main thing you have to do is you have to go into the report and go to manage. And because this report is running when a user is not logged into Windows, it can't use Windows authentication necessarily as a user to ensure that you have the proper security with the report or the underlying data. So I would select manage, go to properties, go to data sources, and I actually have to specify the credentials instead of prompting for the credentials, or I actually have to have them stored within the report themselves. So I can select a Windows username and password, but if the Windows username or password changed, I have to go back into this data source and actually change it. So in this particular case, I'm using a SQL user. I'm just using SA in this case. You probably want to set up a separate user SQL user ID called SSRS or something to that effect with a password. Now this password is stored within the report and encrypted. So the disadvantage with having this type of report is anyone who then has access to the SRSS reports and can get to that particular folder location could run the report. They wouldn't necessarily need access to underlying data because that's now being stored within the report. So I'd provide all this information, click test connection, ensure that I can connect successfully, and now I can continue on. So once I have a report, the next thing to set up the subscription is to go to these three little dots, ellipsis, go to subscribe, and set up a subscription. So set up a new subscription. I'd give it a name. So we'll call it test 1. I could run this on a specific schedule or use a shared schedule. I'm going to edit my schedule. So I'm going to say run this as an example, Tuesday to Saturday, because I want this emailed out 7 a.m. every day to a list of users. We'll change our time to 7 a.m. I can specify a stop date and then hit apply. Now the next thing to do is provide a list of emails that this is getting sent to. So I could say Paul J at profit.ca, and if I wanted to add more users, I could separate this with a semicolon and add another list. So KLT at, you get the